Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's panel discussion on the topic Credit Data to Decisions, Navigating Bankruptcies and SMB Risk. My name is Bill Weiss, and I'm going to be your moderator today. On the panel discussion today, we have Mike Flum, President and Chief Operating Officer at CreditRiskMonitor, Brody Oldham, Senior Director of Analytic Consultancy at Experian, Eric Kiter, Senior Vice President, Data and Credit Solutions of DataAxle, Lita Chindamo, Director at Enterprise Accounts Creditsafe, and Gregory Johnson, Chief Operating Officer at Cortera. In my opinion, a dream team for a credit panel discussion. In today's session, we're going to discuss best practices for portfolio risk analysis, ways to evaluate business risks with minimal data, and some early bankruptcy indicators to watch out for. The discussion will help you identify risk and make better credit decisions. So let's get started. So I'm going to start out with the first question. We all know last year has been somewhat challenging for businesses as we've seen a large number of bankruptcy filings. And recently, many organizations took the opportunity to restructure with Chapter 11 filings. I'd like to get the panel's views on this. What do you think led to this trend? And let's start with you, Mike. What do you think?
Well, I'll try to be brief because, as you all know, I can be a little verbose. But I think in general, when you look at it, debt levels were already staggeringly high at the early 2020. And the pandemic kind of provided a great cover for that restructuring, especially when you're, finding your revenue fall out dramatically. So in general, I think the better question is what happened to all the cash that everybody raised between 2011 and 2020? Close to $5 trillion or more dollars. And the truth of the matter is a lot of it went into buybacks and dividends. And so it wasn't necessarily used to create new projects that would generate future cash flows, which is, I think, one of the things that you saw as a trend within that entire bankruptcy filing. A lot of the retailers that hadn't invested in any of the e-commerce space, those were one of the ones that really got, badly impacted. And you kind of see the results through, record highs in the stock market with those buybacks. You also see it with the surge in BBB, rated credits within the investment grades fund. And you're only now just seeing CapEx start to recover. And that kind of gets back to, I think, the general thought that with interest rates, kind of almost artificially low, there's no natural predator for excessive debt. And it's almost similar to removing wolves from the forest, what happens to the deer population. So, from that peak in 81 at about 15%, the 10-year interest rate dropped all the way down to 1.34% or so, end of 2020. So, over that period of time, non-financial corporate debt expanded over 1,000% from about 1 trillion all the way up to 11 trillion. So when you talk about expansion, that's enormous. And it's not just a US thing, I think JP Morgan published a study back in November of 2020 that only 4% of UK debt, not this corporate, 2% of EU, and 2% of Canadian investment grade debts had yields over 1.5%. So, when you look at that, that's kind of unbelievable when you look at it in the context of history. And that leads to the idea of zombification, which we're seeing across the board. And this is generally companies that can't cover their interest rates or, their interest expenses. We just recently did a study where it's about 28% of US and Canadian publics that have interest coverage ratios below 2x. I think in the UK and Germany, that figure is almost 20% of the businesses out there. So with all that, inflation kind of poses a really big risk to that entire structure. If that goes up, you can't cover your interest expenses, and you're essentially rolling your financial risk right now. That's my take on it.
I love the views. Mike always sounds like an analyst or an economist, so I appreciate that, Mike. Lena, I'll pass it along to you.
Well, great, thank you. I don't even know how I can beat that.
He's hard to follow sometimes. I know.
It's very hard to follow. Thanks so much for all those great points there, Mike. I think we definitely saw an increase in Chapter 11 filings, 35% relative to 2019. I think what kind of led to this was it was industries that really were already taking a beating, and there was already a lot of distressed industries in there. So if you think of retail, apparel, oil and gas, and mining, there's a lot of change, a lot of uncertainty, and all things happen so quickly and so fast. Ways of working and becoming more digitalized, and all the lockdowns that it really did present a whole bunch of challenges to companies. And as a result of that, we've seen a lot more filings because of it.
Excellent. Thanks, Lena. Brody, anything you'd like to chime in?
Yeah, I think that some of the other challenges, covered a pretty good way of us looking at it from a global perspective. I think supply chain certainly played into this, and looking at where businesses could gather some of those commodities from, whether they were here stateside or international. And that certainly led to some challenges. Bringing those stateside to assemble here in the US created challenges for companies being able to build their inventory where they needed to. And so we saw opportunities for this restructuring to happen during the pandemic timeframe. It made it easy. I think a lot of the creditors were a little more flexible with these businesses during this time, so that, in 2019, these companies would have had a little bit more difficult time filing for Chapter 11 and doing some restructuring. The terms probably wouldn't have been as good. So during this pandemic time period, it gave a good opportunity for some of these businesses that have been holding right on the edge to move into this Chapter 11 style of bankruptcy. Now, the other chapters, maintained or went down a bit as far as the number of filings that were coming through. Chapter 11 really went up. I think stimulus helped to keep the other bankruptcy statuses very low. And so we'll see those kind of level out in the next year. But I look at it from the perspective of really an opportunity here to make a change for business and to come out of a pandemic in a stronger position than they went in, so that they can really take advantage of this next growth phase.
Gotcha, and good point on the supply chain. We're definitely feeling the ripple effects of that post pandemic or in this period as well.